Hi, I'm David LePage, the Managing Partner of BiSocial Canada, and I'm pleased to take a few minutes today to talk to you about how we perceive social procurement in Canada, and then some of the progression and history of how it developed from an effort to create impact into a policy model, and now into some implementation examples. So let me begin, first of all, by explaining to you how we perceive social procurement. So when we talk about what is social procurement, we're basically talking about how do we add a social value onto existing purchasing. So we're not talking about changing what you purchase, we're not talking about purchasing differently, but when you purchase, most people look at what is the price, what's the quality, what's the environmental impact, and now we're talking about how do we add a social value to that consideration as well. So we're really talking about how do we create, when we think about what's the best value for money when we're purchasing, because if we just think about purchasing as a transaction, then all we're doing is creating economic value. We're talking about how do we create community value. When we talk about community value, we're really talking about not just economic capital, but it's what we refer to as community capital. And when you think about community capital, you're thinking about the environmental capital, and that's the land and the building and the structure. How do we contribute to that? We're talking about cultural capital. So how do we secure and recognize cultural diversity and celebrate it? And we're talking about economic capital, of course, it's part of it. We're also talking about human capital. How do we build people's skills and capacity? And the last one, probably the glue of community capital, is how do we contribute to social capital? Because social capital is that piece that creates family, friends, and networks that brings together. So when we talk about social procurement outcomes, we're talking about existing purchasing, adding a social value in order to create social value, which means community value, which means community capital. When we do social procurement in Canada, and I think internationally it's the same everywhere, we sort of think about it as two different paths. And so one of the paths of creating social procurement is through what we refer to as social purchasing. And that's the buying of goods and services. So think about catering, thinking about office supplies, thinking about all of the things that are in your supply chain, all the things that you buy in order to do your business or your activity. And when we talk about looking at those, we're looking again, like we mentioned earlier, you also have to consider the quality, the price, the environmental impact. But when you're buying things and stuff and services, how can you add a social value and still get what you need in terms of goods and services, but add a social value as well? So you create a community impact. The other path that we use for social procurement is referred to as the infrastructure side. And that's where we talk about using community benefit agreements. So a community benefit agreement is an agreement between all the stakeholders in an infrastructure investment, talking about government, developers, construction, and community. And so when we talk about community benefit agreements, we're talking about looking at, let's take building a bridge or building a hospital. The impacts in that are tremendous. The design phase means we have to talk about what is going to happen, what impacts we're going to have during construction and during the life of that institution or that structure. So those two paths are the way we think about social procurement. One is adding a social value to the goods and services we buy, called social purchasing. The other one is using community benefit agreements to engage stakeholders through the design, the construction, the operation, and the measurement of impact in our infrastructure investments. So when we think about what are some of the barriers and some of the opportunities, this is where it becomes really, really important to recognize that oftentimes the barriers are more perceived than real. So all of the research and our experience in working with parties around implementing social procurement, we often talk about, like, what are going to be some of those barriers? Is it going to cost us more? Not necessarily. Is it going to create more barriers? Is it going to be more red tape? No, it's not. Is it going to interfere with trade agreements? No, it won't. All the trade agreements can be worked with. You can't exclude bidders, but you definitely can demand the results you want. So when you look at key barriers, be very careful to recognize that many of the barriers are about perceived problems, not real problems. And the other side of it is to recognize that the barriers can be overcome, because when we think about that, we want to think about the barriers and that's change in how we do things, that we're actually looking at opportunities. So if we take what normally is considered risk, we want to look at it and become opportunity creators. We want to look at this like, how can we start to do and use procurement to solve community problems? So we start to look at how can we unbundle some of our contracting? How can we look at the inclusion of social enterprises into our supply chain? How can we start to look at what are the social opportunities that we can create when we're buying the goods and services that we need or when we're building a new structure? So moving from how we do it to some of the history of social procurement in Canada, it's kind of fascinating because we really had to learn about it the hard way. It was probably, 15 years ago when we were working with social enterprises in the inner city in Vancouver, and we realized that what we wanted to do was create jobs for people with barriers. But in fact, what was happening is the employment opportunities were not really there. So we had to move from we're training people for employment to how do we get people jobs? And the only way we could do that was to look at creating demand for people. And so we really started this kind of fascinating thing of working with sort of the tech sector, which no one thought would be hiring people from the inner city, and they wouldn't. But the tech sector actually buys a lot of stuff, and they wanted to be socially involved in the community. So we said, okay, how about if you start buying from social enterprises or start buying from the businesses that will employ people with barriers? So when you buy your catering, think about a social enterprise. When you use a courier, think about a social enterprise. When you buy your office supplies, think about the local office supply company who's made a commitment to hire people from the inner city. So we started this grand idea of a social purchasing portal. We launched it in Vancouver, we took it across Canada, and it failed really well. We learned a lot. We recognized that that wasn't the right model, but we recognized that demand side, that social procurement model could happen. So we actually then were able to use that model to influence some of the purchasing around the Winter Olympics in Vancouver in 2010. Actually, the Olympic Village had a very major community benefit agreement where 10% of the employees who helped build the Olympic Village came from the inner city. And if you remember every Olympics, watch it next time. When they give out the medal, they also give out a bouquet of flowers. Those flowers came from a social enterprise that was training women coming out of prison how to be florists. After our experience with the Vancouver Winter Olympics and some efforts after that, we started to actually think about how could we build something stronger across Canada that connected the efforts that were going on in different communities. There were efforts going on in Winnipeg and Toronto and in Atlantic Canada and Halifax and Vancouver. So it was actually after the Olympics in 2012, we started to talk more about a network for social procurement. And that's when we connected with Social Enterprise UK. They were doing already Buy Social UK. So we actually did a rather major field trip and took a group of Canadians over to the UK to meet with them, to learn from them. And then working with Social Enterprise UK, we were able to franchise or recognize the name Buy Social Canada and take the model from UK, Buy Social, and launch it in Canada in 2014. And so what we've been able to do since then is get some support from some foundations, the McConnell Foundation, Mental Health Institute, and also from the federal government and now from a number of other entities that we're really being able to move from just talking about social procurement, that we actually now have regional partners across the country that are working with us to create a network that supports social procurement. So when we think about how that's evolved across Canada, and this is important if you're implementing social procurement in your area or your country, is that it really is a combination of policy and practice. And so what we've actually seen, like because we were so active in Vancouver in the early, like 2004, when we're talking about this, one of our first partners was actually SAP. So what happened is that when we started talking to tech companies about you should be buying from social enterprises, SAP realized that they bought a lot of catering. So what we were able to do is to leverage SAP's existing purchasing of food, lunches, morning bakery, and have that purchased from a local social enterprise that created jobs for people with barriers in the inner city. So that was our first great experiment. And I have to compliment SAP because, it's now, I think, 10 or 13 years later, and they still are buying their catering from a social enterprise. It's a huge investment over many years. We then started to branch out and start to get policies passed by different provinces and by different municipalities, and we're able to start to leverage this movement of social procurement into policies at the municipal, the provincial, and the federal level. And in fact, now in Canada on the federal level, just recently infrastructure agreements were signed that require local targeted employment for people, for women, people with barriers, and social enterprises. So we're really trying to leverage how can we take this and move from just talking about it, but actually implementing it. And that's been the role of BiSocial Canada, because what we've been able to do is be the focus of how do we advocate and promote social procurement across the gigantic country of Canada. We have 4.5 time zones. We have 90% of the people who live near, the border, and massive. So we've actually figured it out that we have to work from a network model, from a partnership model, but together we can advocate and promote it. We've also created online resources so that we can actually use and create common tools and resources across the country. So BiSocialCanada.com actually provides a place for people to go and look at what are the policies, what's the right language to put in a request for proposal, what can I learn from other communities. The other piece is that we certify suppliers and purchasers. So our suppliers have to be social enterprises. So the social enterprise certification in Canada is you are a business, you buy or sell stuff in the marketplace, you have a social, environmental, or cultural purpose, and the majority of your profits are reinvested into the business. So we look at it from those three things. It's a business with a social value and a lock on assets. So those are the criteria. We also are doing a lot that we recognize, which is really important, is capacity building. Capacity building on the supply side for social enterprises that want to bid, how to respond to opportunities, because oftentimes this is a new item for them. And also a big part of our training now is focused on how do we support purchasers who want to transition their existing purchasing from just being an economic transaction into being something that's actually going to transform their community. So when we look at governments that are trying to solve tough problems, like how do you get employment for people who've been excluded from the labor market? How do you address issues of poverty and social exclusion? Well, we know that social enterprises are a solution. Social enterprises are solving problems that communities and governments are facing. So the more purchasing that we can do to social enterprises, the more community impact we have. And so our model has been, we can use the purchasing of what we do every day in order to create stronger and healthier communities. And that's the purpose of BiSocial. How do we help promote, advocate, and increase the use of social procurement in our communities, in our country, and internationally? So thanks very much. It's been a great opportunity to share some time with you. David LePage with Bi Social Canada.